Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
There is no question that the 2020 election captured the attention of the nation, both leading up to it and the aftermath. Why did Trump lose? Or rather, why did Joe Biden win? Was it truly a close election, and did Joe Biden simply get lucky? Or was it a strategy and cunning that allowed him to prevail? Today, we will answer those questions and more. Lance Jackson, my co-host and an educator of 35 years, is the senior resident historian at TrueChat and will introduce our guests.
Jon Allen is a senior political analyst with NBC News Digital, and Amie Parnes is a senior correspondent for The Hill newspaper in Washington, D.C. Together, they authored the New York Times #1 bestseller, Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. Today, we get to discuss their new book, Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. Jon and Amie, thank you both for taking time to chat with us.
Hey, thanks, Lance. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks so much for having us.
So, Amie, let's start with the book itself. I mean, for some, this is an interesting choice, right? Shattered, your previous book obviously shed light on something that many of us struggled to understand, that being what happened in 2016. But Lucky is about a narrow victory.
Right.
So who is the book intended for, and why is Joe Biden's, as you call it, lucky win something that's worth our time to understand?
It's intended for everybody, Democrats and Republicans alike. And, you know, we've become known for doing these postmortem books, but this book is more than just a postmortem book. It's a look at how this race was run and conducted and what both Democrats and Republicans can learn going forward into the 2022 and 2024 elections. It was so close. It's why we talk about luck being a major factor in this for Joe Biden. But, you know, we also leave the title up to interpretation. You know, some might say Joe Biden was lucky. Some might say the nation was lucky. We leave that up to the reader.
This just occurred to me while you were speaking. Obviously, in 2016, you opted to focus on the person that lost the campaign. But in 2020, we're focusing on the winner. So why is this not about Trump's doomed campaign and rather why Joe Biden was lucky?
That's a good question. I mean, Jon and I obviously made a decision to focus on Biden here because, you know, and everyone basically, we've been hearing a lot of people on Twitter and others saying, you know, why was he so lucky? He won by 81 million votes. But the thing is, it could have gone either way. It could have gone sideways for Biden and it went that way for Trump. But, you know, Jon and I look at the reality of this is that elections are decided by the Electoral College vote, and it was 43,000 votes. The margin was a lot closer even than 2016. So we decided to look at what happened and how Biden was able to win, but it was still so close.
There was a Democratic primary this time, and there was not a Republican primary this time, which meant that there was a lot more to the election than on the Democratic side than there was on the Republican side. So I think that had something to do with the decision making. But in addition to that, I think the questions of why Trump lost are maybe more self-evident than why Biden won. We also go kind of inside the Trump campaign in a way that we didn't really in our last book. So there's a little bit more of a balance there than there was in the last book. For all of those reasons, we focused on Biden, but also brought in a sort of heavy helping of Trump and what went wrong for him and what went right for him.
It's so true. When I was reading the book, you would go back and forth that way, and even bringing in some of the Democratic challengers and how their decisions affected the Biden campaign. And so, you know, and it was really hard to come up with questions. So, Jon, first one here, heading into Iowa, things didn't look good for Biden. If the Iowa results had been released, we know there was a snafu there, or some of us do, if you want to talk about that a little bit, and how the Democratic Party kind of at the time, it looked like they really messed up. But the Iowa results, if they'd been released in a more typical fashion and Pete Buttigieg had been declared the winner, would that have changed anything? Do you think that was one of the early signs of luck for President Biden?
Yes, absolutely. And let me go back a little further. We go into all of this stuff in pretty detailed fashion, but Biden's campaign was going so poorly in Iowa in late 2019, months before the caucuses, that his top advisors started to engineer a silent coup against his campaign manager, a guy named Greg Schultz. I mean, they could see that Biden wasn't getting any traction. And then, right before the caucus day, there was the Des Moines Register CNN poll of Iowa a couple days before the caucuses is considered by some to be the most consequential poll in politics, certainly in Democratic presidential politics, because it sort of sets the table for Iowa voters, not only where they are, but kind of gives them an idea of who might win. Pete Buttigieg's campaign caught wind of a flaw in one call in that poll and was able to use that to get CNN and the Des Moines Register to not release their poll. I mean, CNN had this, whole special ready to go this, 2 nights before the caucus. And ultimately they pulled the poll, which had Bernie Sanders winning, in the lead in a very strong way. And Pete Buttigieg was in third place. And the Buttigieg people realized that this was going to be a huge problem for them. It was also a problem for Joe Biden, who was ranked fourth and a very distant fourth at that point. And the fact that the poll got spiked meant that there wasn't a whole news cycle where Bernie Sanders was being declared to Iowa voters as the winner of the caucus before it even happens. And then, John Kerry, we report on John Kerry, who was in Iowa as a surrogate for Biden, was traveling with him. And Kerry got on the phone the morning before the caucuses, gets on the phone with a friend and starts going through what it would take for John Kerry to jump in the race because he seemed so confident that Biden was going to fail. Here's one of his top allies toying with the idea of running for president. And then on the caucus day, people may remember or not that the reporting technology that the Iowa Democratic Party used, it was an app, it failed. And nobody knew who the winner was. Nobody who knew exactly where people were going to come in. And it allowed Biden, who comes in fourth, to leave Iowa without all of the political obituary writers writing his political obituary. He sort of gets to say, and, we had a decent night on to New Hampshire. Whereas I think had those results been clear, whether it was Buttigieg or Sanders winning, Biden ends up being, half the story as a fourth place finisher. In addition to that, Buttigieg winning Iowa in a clear way may have given him a little bit of a lift as the sort of establishment answer to Bernie Sanders.
Amie, you lay out why Warren was the consensus pick among Obama and the Democratic elite immediately before the Iowa caucuses. And in fact, I thought the conversation that you both were able to share, Pete Buttigieg's conversation with Obama and kind of how Obama was not impressed with him. And yet this is the guy, right, that arguably wins Iowa. So what happened to change the Democratic elite and Obama's perspective on Warren being the consensus choice? I mean, why did that take place, and how did it allow some space for Biden to claim the lead? I
think, in the fall of 2019, Warren was sort of the front runner. I think Biden was always sort of the front runner, but in a way, but Warren kind of claimed the title for a while, was leading in some polls. And what was interesting was that she gained a lot of support, even from someone like President Obama. I think he could, in a way, relate to the campaign that she was running. He thought that it was a good campaign. And we have one scene in the book that was very telling, where President Obama, former President Obama, is meeting with a group of Black donors at a posh New York restaurant. And he feels comfortable with them. These are longtime supporters of his. And people in the room are essentially saying that he's giving them a sense of what he really thinks. And he's been so private about this. When reporters and everyone asked him what he thought of the horse race, he didn't want to weigh in. But with this group of 40 people or so, he was very candid, and they were asking him, what do you think of the race? And he was essentially giving them his 2 cents. And so he's telling them essentially, he's backing Warren without using the E word, endorsement. But he is also kind of taking a jab at Mayor Pete and saying, he's gay and he's short, and kind of having fun with the fact that one person in the room said he was ribbing him sort of like he would rib his own name, Barack Obama, and it was kind of in jest. But I think people walked away from, and I think the biggest part of that whole conversation is that he leaves out Biden and has to be reminded by one donor in the room, you forgot Biden. And so all of this is happening, and it was a very telling moment, because you could kind of see where he and other people, maybe in Obama world, were at the time. And I think they did think that while Mayor Pete had a lot of enthusiasm behind him, that he wasn't quite ready for the job. Like, how do you make the leap from mayor of a small town like South Bend to the White House? I think a lot of people thought that was quite a jump.
Well, and it's kind of interesting that you mentioned the Biden perspective, because it's like, well, we're talking about Warren positively, maybe kind of poking fun at Buttigieg, but at least they're part of the conversation. And the man that was my vice president didn't really even make the conversation at all. And I think as you tell that story, it becomes clear, at least to the readers, that Biden really had an uphill battle before him. There was a lot of people that didn't want him to run or didn't think he could win, but he seemed to have faith, and we've got some more to discuss on that. We've been talking with Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes about how Joe Biden secured a win in the 2020 election and became president. But a number of questions still remain. How did Biden select his vice president? And what does the future hold for our divided nation? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we're speaking with Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes about their new book, Lucky: How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency.
First of all, I read the book and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think I recommend it highly to everybody. But you talk about the VP selection process in the book. And according to your research, what was the most important reason or reasons that President Biden ended up choosing now Vice President Kamala Harris? And also the process, you talk about how it took so long and how, and how that kind of plays into Biden's personality. I mean, he really kind of let it drag out right up until the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, he used to be a young man in a hurry, and now he's not a young man and he's less in a hurry, and wants things to come to him. And
I like that.
his decision-making process is pretty slow most of the time. And I think he likes to take in as much information as he can, and he doesn't want to make a rash decision that's a mistake. And I think part of that was contrasting with Trump, who was somebody who woke up in the morning charging to go in one direction and might wake up the next morning charging to go in the other direction. But in terms of the vice presidential selection process, Biden, as we report, had, come to a conclusion as early as the midterms of 2018 that if he ran for president, he would want a woman as his vice presidential candidate. And we even report that in 2015, when he was considering running for president and chose not to ultimately, that he had basically offered the vice presidential slot to Elizabeth Warren before the campaign even started. And she had, he had basically said to her, he wanted her support, he wanted her endorsement, and he floated the vice presidential idea, and she basically said she would, keep her cards close to her vest and figure it out later. But in this process, he had, pretty early on, I guess in March of 2020, in a debate with Bernie Sanders, said publicly he was going to choose a woman, which limited his options. And I think, the George Floyd protests, over the summer of 2020 really started to make it clear to a lot of Democrats that he was best off with an African-American vice presidential candidate, in part because he wasn't, and we write about this in the book, he was resistant to some of the pressure from within his own campaign to meet activists where they were, on police reform. So he was, unwilling to apologize for the crime bill, which some of his aides wanted him to do. He was unwilling to say defund the police, which some of his aides wanted him to do. And as it comes down closer to the vice presidential process getting done, you see Amy Klobuchar drop out of the running and basically say that he should pick somebody who's African American. So now you're largely down to African American women, although Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, who's white, and Tammy Duckworth, who's Asian American, and some others were in that mix. You're really starting to point hard toward a black woman as his pick. I think the obvious choice all along was Kamala Harris, in part because her resume fits what a traditional vice presidential candidate's resume looks like, in terms of, having been elected to the Senate. She ran for president this time. She was a state attorney general in California. Some of the other women who were in the mix didn't have, that kind of experience as an elected official. Some of them didn't have the kind of star power on the stage that Harris has. I mean, whatever her flaws, she's, and we write about this in the book, she's really able to sort of, make a moment. Her ability to sort of command the camera is pretty good. So, Biden's going through this process, and what it looks like he's doing is trying to figure out who other than Kamala Harris he might be able to choose. There was a lot of resentment left over from her hitting him on a debate stage in June of 2019 on his stance on school busing and his kind talk about segregationists that he had worked with. And so there's this resentment that's going on. And ultimately what he does is goes through this process of elimination. And we detail it in Lucky pretty tightly.
Amie, as we're thinking about, Joe Biden selects Kamala Harris, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not that was a wise choice, regardless of resume. How would it play with those beloved swing voters? And that kind of brings us to, why was the final election closer than many thought? I mean, it seems that President Trump made mistakes and President Biden had a lot of things that broke his way. But why wasn't it an even bigger win for the Democrats, both for Biden and down the ballot? When we look at 2016, a lot of people and a lot of polls indicated it was going to go the other way. And here in 2020, polls say it's going to go Biden's way, but it's going to go bigger his way than it did. So what accounted for that?
It's interesting because mostly when Jon and I looked at the various events of this past election season, very few things kind of swung or helped either candidate. Things remained the same the entire time, which was very interesting. I think what happened was, COVID obviously was a huge factor in this. And it took up obviously the back half of this race throughout the general election. And what happens is Joe Biden is unable to get out on the campaign trail. He's sidelined. President Trump at the time is taking over the airwaves, and he's also making missteps. He basically tells in one briefing, he's having these daily briefings, and he is encouraging maybe injection of bleach and other things. And so he is doing damage to himself. Meanwhile, Republicans are accusing Biden of hiding in his basement, but it's actually very helpful to him. And we have a scene in the book where Anita Dunn, who is one of his senior advisors at the time, she's with him still at the White House now. She essentially confides in an associate and says, COVID is the best thing that ever happened to him, meaning to Biden. And I think that was a moment that explained a lot of what Biden aides were thinking at the time, that they saw the pandemic as being helpful to him in several ways. It took him off the campaign trail. He was unable to make these gaffes that he's so prone to making. But it also positioned himself sort of as doing the right thing and staying home. And by default, he became the leader in that way.
And they were both really able, everybody talks about the turnout for President Biden, but President Trump actually received more votes in this 2020 election than he did in 2016. So they were both able to turn out voters in record numbers. But both of these elections have certainly highlighted in 2020 and 2016 have certainly highlighted our country's divide. Jon, in the age of instantaneous news, tweets, and social media updates, how can each of us navigate the truth to make the discerning decisions about our democracy in the future?
It's such a big question, and I do think it comes down to sort of individual choices. We all get our news. Almost all of us get our news from sort of preferred outlets, and we are suspicious of non-preferred outlets, and we self-select in terms of who we follow on Twitter or which friends of ours on Facebook we pay attention to, with memes that they're sharing. And I think it's important for everyone to try to take in what's being said by people they don't agree with. For each of them, for each person to make a judgment about what's valuable about what the folks on the other side are saying. And obviously some of it you will discredit or not believe or whatever. But I think it's important to remember that the politicians and the political parties are interested in you dividing yourselves. And that's not necessarily in the interest of the country as a whole. Our founding fathers were warned about factionalization. And we really are in these sort of silos. And, one of the things we try to do with this book and with all of our books is to try to get behind the scenes a little bit and tell people things that they don't know about how campaigns operate, about how government operates, and that will not necessarily make everyone happy. It's not necessarily the narrative that President Biden wants. It's not necessarily the narrative that former President Trump wants. So, I think we as a people we share so much more in common, despite our cultural divides and our economic divides. And it's really in the interest, like I said, of the politicians and of parties to divide us. And they've done a very good job of it. And I don't think it serves us individually or collectively as a country very well.
I don't know, Lance, if you and I could have planned a better promotion for the show, but
that's exactly what we try to say there. Exactly. You're right.
Yeah. He gave us a very nice setup there to say, and that's exactly why people should listen to this program, because that's what we're all about here, right? Is those honest, open, and respectful conversations. What's the one thing that you would hope people take away from the book? If there was nothing else and you had to give them, in one sentence, this is what you need to take away, what would it be, Amie?
It's basically, we keep getting questions about the title and why lucky and why barely. And what we do in the book is we basically take you inside to see the lucky breaks, how Biden was lucky, how the country was lucky. 43,000 votes, as I mentioned. We don't go by the popular vote in this country. So I think people need to kind of dive in to this book and see exactly what we're talking about and how it doesn't just talk about the past, but the future.
What Amie's talking about with the 43,000 votes is it would have taken Donald Trump just 43,000 votes over 3 states to win a second term. And for Republicans, that means they've got to figure out how to recalibrate to win the next election. And for Democrats, they have to figure out how they do a better job of, matching the electoral college to their popular vote margins, because they're probably not going to win elections by 8 million votes every time, 7 or 8 million votes every time. But to me, the closeness of this election, and certainly the other thing I would want people to take away is just there's really deep reporting here that you've never seen anywhere else that will help illuminate, how the parties operate and how the candidates operate and how the operatives operate.
In order to provide the picture you've provided us, the relationships that have to be cultivated and the people that have to trust you enough to share this information, certainly speaks to why the book is an interesting read, especially for people like Lance and I that want to go deeper and understand what exactly did happen. So how can we use what we've learned today from Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes in our modern society? And how might these conversations and observations better inform our discussion about today's leaders? Well, that's what Lance and I are going to discuss in the next segment of the show. Jon and Amie, we appreciate you taking some time to speak with Lance and me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much.
You can purchase Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency, by going to thestateofus.org or find it anywhere books are found. What do Lance and I think about the case Jon and Amie have made, and what does the future hold for our nation? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
An interesting interview today. We got to speak to the co-authors of Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. You know, the interest here in that, and we mentioned this in the interview with them, the selection of talking about why Joe Biden was lucky as opposed to how, Trump was either unlucky or kind of helped his own demise. And I think it was Jon that pointed out, right, that in a lot of ways, the failures of the Trump campaign were self-evident to a lot of people, while understanding just how lucky Joe Biden was not as evident.
Well, everybody but me, because I remember talking to you and to my daughters, and they're like, Dad, there's no way Biden. I'm like, you watch. I said, it's sad when you think about it, because you have all of these, more progressive, new idea, younger Democrats that we're going to end up with two old white guys running for president. But I said, I just think that's where the country is right now. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I mean, that's where we should be. But I think that's where we were after the last election, after 2016. They talked about how close the election was, and, closer than it was in 2016 in the Electoral College. Just a prepositional phrase, but it's huge because people don't understand. And, we actually have done that book and talked about it before. And I think that's one of the important things to do when you get this book and read it, is to understand the selection process for president. The whole Biden campaign was around flipping Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And it wasn't until the end of the election that they thought they had a chance at, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. For Trump, it was like, okay, his campaign was, how can we keep Florida? And then how can we keep Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin?
Well, because even when people look at the Electoral College counts, in terms of, total number awarded, right? It doesn't really paint that picture, which they explain is really 40,000 some votes across 3 states is what allowed him to win. And while, he gets 300 plus electoral votes versus Trump's only 200 some, that's not really the story of the margin. And I think part of what speaks to it being so close is, for the first time in, I think it's the last 3 or 4 presidents, the person that won Florida and Ohio didn't win the election. And I think it goes to show, I think that speaks to how close it was, because usually, those states are a given as a must win. And so when you can make the electoral math work without them, that it wasn't, that there wasn't much wiggle room there. Not taking those early on meant, okay, we know this thing's going to go on for a while, and it's a close electoral map to make it work without taking either of those 2 states. I mean, and you and I talked about that pre-election, you take one of those 2, okay, but to not take either, it can still be done, obviously, but it's certainly more complicated. And 40,000 versus 70,000 in 2016 being the margin, I think people forget that. And to me, that's, to your point, that perfectly illustrates just how close this election was, even though it maybe didn't feel that way. For a lot of people, it probably didn't feel that way.
Well, I want to take it to the Democratic nomination process, because you kind of started there with, you didn't think Biden even had a chance, and, what's this old white guy doing? And I said, I don't think he's going to be there. But in the book, they really hit that process. And there were a couple questions that we didn't get to ask them because of time constraints. But you go to Iowa, and they did briefly mention the Des Moines Register poll and how the Buttigieg campaign put that down, said, wait a minute, you made some mistakes, so you really don't want to. And they make a really big point of it in the book at how hard the Buttigieg campaign went after the media to not release that. And, even mentioned, just Jon mentioned, I think briefly, how CNN had a whole show wrapped around it, didn't do it. Wow, what power do the campaigns have when they can shut down one of the major polls taken in the process of the nomination process and not even put it out. Yes, it was flawed, but how much impact that does have and the media does have on who even gets the nomination, much less who becomes president. And then also and then correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Buttigieg the first Democrat to, quote, win Iowa who didn't get the nomination?
Yeah.
And here, so, I mean, is it changing the whole nomination process for the Democrats? Is Iowa not going to play a role? Because there was a while there where they talk about it in the book, where Biden was even flying out there an idea of not even going to Iowa. We're just going to skip Iowa because we know we can't do well in Iowa. And we may go to New Hampshire, but, we're just going to run all the way to South Carolina, which is what they ended up doing. They basically, finished in the bottom half of the polls in the early states and just went to South Carolina and turned it all around.
The coverage in the book of the other campaigns, and what they had done right and what they did wrong was pretty fascinating. And particularly, obviously, the Iowa situation, because to your point, traditionally, the person that wins that goes on to get the nomination. That's pretty common. And I still feel that, it would be fascinating to know who our president would be right now if Iowa had gone the way that it typically goes, because I think you probably would have ended up with a mostly crushed field, except for maybe, Warren and Sanders and Buttigieg. You probably, and at some point, that Sanders or Warren would have dropped out and their group would have, so the question becomes, because I think you and I have talked about, if one of them got the nomination, I have a hard time seeing a way that they win the general election, and I'm talking about Warren and Sanders, just because I'm not sure that the mainstream of the country, the people, those 40,000 people, I'm not sure that they're ready for a lot of what Sanders and Warren were selling. At the same time, if Buttigieg gets the nomination, are they ready for, an openly gay candidate?
Whereas his politics were more centrist. Though.
Exactly.
If they look at the ideas, his centrist ideas, he and Klobuchar and Biden were all going after the same voters as far as the centrist idea, with Warren and Sanders being the more progressive candidates. So, yeah, would they have overlooked the cultural issue with Buttigieg and just looked at his centrist policies being so close to Biden's? And, the other thing was, they point out in the book that Biden got a lot of support and actually, was part of his campaign process to get the African-American or the black support. And we know that historically, Buttigieg has had trouble getting that support. And that was a key demographic for the Democrats winning in 2020. And would Buttigieg have been able to, would they have voted? Because like they did in Hillary, they just didn't vote. I mean, they point that out in the book too. The black majority voters didn't turn out in 2016. And that's one reason why Hillary lost. And Biden was able to get those folks to the polls. I'd
like somebody to do an analysis on, because we hear a lot about the black vote and the way it affects, whether or not the Democrat can win. I do wonder though, maybe we overplay that in the sense that when we look at how close it was, who were those 40,000 people? Because at least from what I saw, it's a lot of suburban, America, a lot of white folks, which doesn't mean that's how it should be. But I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not sure if you increase the inner city turnout, yes, that helps your overall numbers for the state, but it would be fascinating. I guess I'm not saying that I know one way or the other. It would be fascinating to know those 70,000 in 2016, those 40,000. We did that big piece a couple years ago on the analysis of the 70,000 and finding out that those were mostly what hurt Hillary Clinton were the Sanders supporters that didn't go vote.
They just stayed home. But that was my point about the black voters, is that they stayed home and they turned out. And the book points out too that it's the African-American vote and the suburban moms, that those were the two key demographics that the Biden and Trump campaign were both working for. as well as then the Latino vote and how well President Trump did with capturing greater numbers of the Latino vote.
I do think that was one of the things that was undercovered as a result of the election, because I think it's fascinating, the additional support that Trump garnered, which arguably helped him win Florida, was the additional support amongst the Latino community. And to me, it speaks to the larger issue, Lance, that we've talked about, which is this: Republicans, Democrats in particular, have drawn a lot of these kind of lines in the sand of who we're for, right? And Republicans have done a lot of who we're against. And isn't it interesting how the people they think that they're working for are often on the other side of the fence? And not that the whole Latino community is that way by any means. I mean, obviously Biden got a lot of votes there, but the fact that Trump did as well as he did, I think, is a signal that this idea that immigration is owned by, Democrats, right? Or that family values, we just talked about that with the child tax credit, is owned by Republicans. And to John's point at the end of, that's what we have to do as a nation to move out of this funk and everything that we're in of believing that we're more divided than we are. We're only as divided as we allow ourselves to be convinced that we are. People are rarely one issue voters, and they're usually complex and diverse. And that's why, to just say that there's no way that Buttigieg or Sanders or Warren could have won, I don't know. I mean, I think that's underestimating the American people, in the same way that everybody who said there's no way that Donald Trump could win, right? I mean,
that's true too. No, very good point.
He was our president for 4 years, folks. So, everybody was convinced, this guy can't win. Even people that like Trump, I think there was a lot of them that felt like, we're going to support him, but realistically, we know this guy's not going to win. And here he was, and he was president. So, I think that speaks to the complexity of American voters and hopefully what we're trying to do on the show, right?
Right. Well, I mean, today's episode is a great one here for the mission statement. And our mission statement is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we had that with 4 people today, and this book does it. And like they said, it's for Democrats and Republicans and independents. Everybody needs to read it because you get a better look into what goes on, the process of how we end up with the president of the United States. So if you like today's show and you've listened to it and you go to share it with other folks and they say, well, how do we listen to this show? Well, we recommend that you tell them. They can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is both a syndicated radio program and a podcast. New episodes of the podcast are released Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. East. The syndicated radio show can be heard on the weekends in select talk markets. And we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. Let us know your thoughts on today's episode. Are you going to pick up a copy of this book? It was enjoyable. And again, you can purchase it pretty much everywhere books are found. We've got it linked at thestateofus.org. So be sure to check it out. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.